The bruise high on Aaron's cheekbone should have been just another shadow in a room filled with them, another mark of silence on a woman who moved through Do Hwi-jin's life like a ghost. But when she stepped between his cold steel and the man kneeling on the floor, the deadly calm he used for executions shattered into something raw and unrecognizable. He had built an empire on the blood of traitors, but the quiet courage in her locked gaze made him feel, for the first time, completely out of control. Aaron's hand remained raised, a fragile barrier against the violence that filled the air. "Stop," she whispered, her voice a tremor that held more weight than the weapon in his hand. Do Hwi stepped closer, his white shirt crisp against the disheveled carnage of the room, and watched as she refused to retreat. For 6 months, Aaron had been a presence he merely felt, scent of citrus and quiet footsteps. She was a master of the art of being present without being seen, a woman who had spent a lifetime folding herself smaller to survive the important people. But today, that careful invisibility was gone. In its place was a moral authority that forced the King of Shadows to see her not as a maid, but as the only real thing in his tomb of an empire. Do Hwi-jin did not lower the weapon, but his focus shifted with a predatory precision that made the air in the office turn brittle. Kale Virex remained a blurred, sobbing heap on the floor, his life suspended by a thread of silence. Do Hwa's eyes, dark and missing nothing, traveled from the steel in his hand to the fresh, angry bruise high on Aaron's cheekbone. It was an emotionally loud mark on a woman he had categorized as part of the furniture for 6 months. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice falling into that deadly, rhythmic calm that usually preceded a final sentence. He ignored the traitor entirely now. Aaron's hand remained raised, her modest service attire and neat low bun a stark contrast to the violence she was interrupting. She didn't flinch. She had spent 28 years perfecting the art of being invisible, of moving through spaces without disturbing the air, but that carefully constructed mask had finally shattered. "It doesn't matter, Mr. Jin," she whispered, her fingers trembling as they ghosted over the edge of the swelling. "What matters is that you don't do this. Not today." Do Hwa stepped closer, his expensive shoes silent on the floor. He stopped inches from her, the scent of bergamot and something darker, smoke or cold iron, wrapping around her. He reached out, his thumb hovering near the bruise without touching it, seeking a permission Aaron didn't know how to give. In that small, reflexive moment where she didn't step back, something ancient and protective roared to life inside him. He saw the flicker of fear in her dark eyes, but it wasn't fear of him. It was the weariness of a survivor who had already faced a different kind of monster. He realized then that while he had been controlling Los Angeles's underworld for 15 years, this woman had been fighting a war in the shadows of her own life, a war he knew nothing about. "You think you're a ghost, Aaron," he murmured, his thumb finally ghosting over the edge of the bandage. "I notice everything in my space. I notice the way you rearrange the flowers and the way you quiet your breathing when I enter a room. You are the only real thing in this tomb." The traitor groaned in the background, a reminder of the blood yet to be spilled, but Do Hwa's jaw tightened as he looked at Aaron's wrist, where finger-shaped marks darkened her skin. The deadly calm in his chest was replaced by a sharp, focused fury. He wasn't just a boss anymore, he was a man seeing a reflection of a pain he couldn't execute away. The silence in the office was a physical weight, thick with the scent of bergamot and the metallic tang of Kale's terror. Do Hwi-jin lowered the weapon, but he did not pocket it. Instead, he turned his full, devastating attention toward Aaron, studying her with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Any other person would have been dismissed, or worse, for stepping into the path of his judgment. But Aaron remained standing, her posture steady despite the modest service attire that marked her as someone meant to be invisible. "You should be halfway to the elevator by now," Do Hwi said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more authority than a shout. He stepped into her personal space, his sharp jawline tight, his dark eyes searching hers for the reflexive retreat he was used to seeing in everyone he met. I am a man who speaks the language of violence fluently. I have built this empire through blood and ruthlessness. So tell me, Aaron Solvay, why are you still here? Why aren't you afraid of me? Aaron didn't look down at her second-hand shoes or the blood-stained carpet where the traitor knelt. She met his gaze with a moral authority that seemed to paralyze the room's momentum. "I've spent 28 years being overlooked, Mr. Jin," she replied, her voice soft but absolute. "I've learned that the loudest people are rarely the most dangerous, and the most dangerous men don't usually notice when their maid rearranges their books by color because she thinks it looks better." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps hurt, crossed Do-hee's features. He had lived 15 years in a world of differential bows and calculated fear. Yet this woman, who earned double the agency rate just to be a ghost in his penthouse, was looking at him as if she truly saw him. "You think you know me because you clean my floors?" he challenged, his thumb ghosting near the edge of her bandage again. "I know you notice the flowers I bring when I think you aren't looking," she countered, her heart hammering against her ribs, though her expression remained carved from stone. "I know that a man who cares about 3 inches of fresh air but hates the wind isn't as cold as the world thinks he is." Do-hee's hand stilled. The deadly calm was still there, but it was no longer directed at the traitor. It was focused entirely on her, a silent interrogation of the soul. He realized she wasn't staying because she was brave. She was staying because she had decided he was worth the risk. The interrupted execution remained a suspended reality. Kale was still there, terrified and bound, but his immediate threat was replaced by the silent, intense gravity of Urin and Do-hwa's standoff. After the initial demand for answers, Do-hwa did not fire her. Instead, he simply watched, allowing Urin to return to her work with an unnerving, hyper-focused interest. She began her routine, but it was subtly altered. The office was too saturated with the shadow of death, so Urin, the master of invisibility, began rearranging the space not just to clean, but to heal. She started with the window, pulling the heavy blinds fully open to let the late afternoon light flood the room, replacing the grim metallic shadows with warm amber bars of sun. It was an audacity that should have been met with a command to stop, but Do-hwa simply leaned against the edge of his mahogany desk, the weapon finally holstered, and observed. She moved to the books. The expensive leather-bound volumes, previously stacked in a haphazard but authoritative pile, were now carefully organized by subject, then by color, introducing a rhythm and flow where before there had only been static wealth. He watched her hands, the same hands that bore the fading finger-shaped marks, handle the objects with a reverence he had only ever seen applied to weapons and money. When she was done, the entire bookcase radiated quiet intention. Next came the air. The heavy, stagnant smell of fear and expensive cologne was banished by the citrus notes of her cleaning solution, and, most daringly, the small bunch of bodega lilies she pulled from her bag and placed in a simple glass on the corner of his desk. He hated the smell of lilies. Too soft, too distracting, but he found himself unable to dismiss them. For the first time since he built his empire, Do-hwa Jin felt the architecture of his life being challenged, not by a rival gang or a police raid, but by a maid's quiet insistence on beauty. She wasn't just cleaning his home, she was cleaning his soul, one deliberate, gentle act at a time. He realized that the bruise on her face, the mark of the survivor, wasn't just a sign of past abuse, it was a silent sermon, proving that strength wasn't about the power to destroy, but the courage to restore. She was replacing shadows with light, and she was doing it in the heart of his tomb. The golden light from the newly opened blinds fell across Kyle Virex, who was still trembling on the floor, a jagged contrast to the serene order Aaron was restoring to the room. Do-Wei-Jin watched the traitor, then looked at Aaron, whose steady hands were now smoothing the edges of a leather-bound journal. The weapon was gone, but the air remained charged with a new, unconventional form of justice. "He owes a debt," Do-Wei said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade through silk. "And in my world, debts are paid in blood. But you say this isn't the way." He gestured toward Kyle, who looked up with wide, fearful eyes, his disheveled white shirt stained with the sweat of a man who had already tasted his own death. Erin paused, her eyes locking onto Do-Wei's, with that quiet courage that had already managed to halt an execution. "Blood doesn't pay for anything, Mr. Jin. It only makes more ghosts." Do-Wei stepped toward Kyle, the dark tattoo on his neck appearing like a shadow against his crisp white collar. He didn't strike the man. Instead, he looked at him with a cold, focused restraint that was far more terrifying than rage. "You betrayed the organization for a few pieces of silver because you thought serving yourself was worth more than loyalty. You will learn differently." He turned back to Aaron. "If I give him to the shadows, he dies. If I give him to you, he works. He will clean your floors, carry your supplies, and learn how to move through a room without disturbing the air, just as you have." Kyle blinked, the absurdity of the sentence momentarily overriding his terror. Aaron hesitated, looking at the broken man and then at the mafia boss, who was offering a bridge between their disparate worlds. "He is under your supervision," Do-Wei said, his tone absolute. "He will see what it means to be invisible, yet essential. He will learn the value of service over betrayal. If he fails you, if he even breathes in a way that makes you flinch, I will finish what I started today." Aaron looked at Kyle, then back at Do-Wei. She saw the barely restrained violence still simmering in his eyes, but she also saw a man trying to speak her language, however clumsily. She nodded slowly. "Get up," she told Kyle, her voice echoing the authority she had seen Do-Wei use, but tempered with a grace that was entirely her own. "There is work to do." As Kyle stumbled to his feet, a disheveled consequence of his own greed, Do-Wei watched them. He had spent 15 years ordering executions, but as he watched the maid lead the traitor toward a bucket and a cloth, he felt the world shifting beneath his feet. He was no longer just a king of shadows, he was a student of a woman who knew that the greatest power wasn't the ability to take a life, but the patience to rebuild one. The penthouse was silent, save for the rhythmic, distant scrubbing of kale in the kitchen, a sound of penance that Do-Wei had never expected to hear in his home. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city of Los Angeles sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he had won through blood. Erin was nearby, polishing the mahogany surface of his desk, her movements fluid and practiced. The late afternoon light caught the edge of her bandage, turning the white gauze into a beacon he could no longer ignore. "You said it didn't matter," Do-Wei began, his voice barely a murmur, yet it commanded the air. He turned to face her, his sharp features softened by a curiosity that felt dangerously like concern. "The man who gave you that bruise, in my world I would have found him by now. I would have made sure he could never lift a hand again." Erin stopped her work. She didn't look up immediately, her fingers tracing the wood grain as if searching for the right words. "I know you would, Mr. Jin. You speak a language of finality. You think protection is a wall built out of fear." She finally raised her eyes, meeting his gaze with a steady, old-soul wisdom that made his empire feel like a house of cards. But violence doesn't protect the heart. It just hardens the shell until there's nothing left inside but echoes. She moved toward him, stopping just outside the circle of his personal space. His name was Marcus. He was someone I loved, someone I thought was my shelter. When he started using his fists, he told me the same thing you tell your enemies, that he was doing it to keep things under control. Her voice cracked, a small sound that echoed louder than a gunshot in the expansive room. The day I left, I realized that true protection isn't someone who fights for you. It's someone who makes you feel safe enough that you don't have to fight at all. Dahui's jaw tightened, his hand lifting toward her face as if to wipe away a memory he couldn't reach. He threatened your life. He threatened your peace. And if you kill him, you haven't saved me, Erin countered, her voice gaining a moral authority that seemed to vibrate through the marble floors. You've just replaced one shadow with another. You've become the thing I spent 7 years running from. Dahui felt a flicker of pain, or perhaps hurt, cross his face. He had built his life on being untouchable, on the deadly calm of his authority. But looking at Erin, he realized that her scars weren't signs of weakness. They were a language he had forgotten how to speak. She was challenging the very foundation of his power, suggesting that his language of violence was just a louder way of being afraid. For the first time, the King of Shadows wondered if his crown was actually a cage. The fragile peace within the penthouse shattered 3 days later. Doha was in his study, the scent of Erin's lilies still clinging to the air, when a frantic cow burst in, his face pale and his hands shaking. He didn't need to speak. The surveillance feed on the wall told the story. In the parking structure below, 3 men from a rival faction, men who had been looking for a crack in Doha's armor, had intercepted Erin as she arrived for her shift. Doha's expression shifted instantly, the deadly calm vanishing behind a mask of cold authority. He didn't shout, he moved with the silence of a predator who had found his mark. As he reached for the weapon he had promised her he wouldn't use, he felt the weight of her words from the day before. Violence doesn't protect the heart. By the time he reached the garage, his men had the rivals surrounded, guns drawn. Erin stood in the center of the circle, her cleaning caddy gripped tight, her eyes locked on the leader of the intruders. She wasn't screaming, she was breathing with the steady, practiced rhythm of someone who had survived far worse than a street-level intimidation tactic. "Step away from her," Doha commanded, his voice a low vibration that made the air turn brittle. The rival leader sneered, pressing a blade closer to Erin's throat. This was the moment of decision. Every instinct Doha had honed over 15 years of controlling Los Angeles's underworld screamed for blood. He could end all 3 men before they could blink. He could make them disappear with a phone call, as he had done so many times before. But then he saw Erin's eyes. She wasn't looking at the knife, she was looking at him, searching for the man she believed he could be, the man who provided protection without becoming a monster. "Let them go," Doha said, his voice raw with the effort of restraint. His men wavered, confused by the order. "Drop your weapons and walk out. If you leave now, there is no blood, only mercy." The rival leader laughed, but the laughter died when he saw the barely restrained violence in Doha's eyes. It wasn't the look of a weak man, it was the look of a king who was choosing to spare a subject he could easily crush. Slowly, the blade retreated. The men backed away, disappearing into the shadows of the concrete pillars. Erin's knees buckled as the tension broke, and Doha was there in 3 strides, catching her before she hit the ground. He didn't reach for his gun, he reached for her hand, his thumb ghosting over her knuckles with devastating gentleness. He had chosen the altar of mercy over the throne of blood, and as he held her, he realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was losing control. He felt like he was finally finding it. The act of mercy in the garage reverberated through the penthouse like a silent alarm. In the days that followed, the deadly calm that had once defined Do Hee-jin's authority began to fracture, replaced by a sharp, focused attention on the lives within his walls rather than the empire outside them. He spent less time on the phone ordering dismissals and more time watching Erin as she moved through his space, her presence no longer an invisible convenience, but the only real thing in his tomb of an apartment. The change did not go unnoticed. His brothers in arms, men who had stood by him through 15 years of blood and ruthlessness, began to whisper in the marble corridors. They saw the way he looked at the maid, not with the distant politeness of a master, but with an intensity that made his skin warm. They noticed that Kyle, the traitor who should have been a ghost, was still breathing, his disheveled white shirt replaced by a clean uniform as he worked under Aaron's quiet, firm supervision. The first cracks surfaced during a meeting with his senior lieutenants. A young differential man emerged from the elevator to report a situation in Koreatown that required a sharp jawline and a hard hand. Traditionally, Do-hee would have responded with syllables weighted with disbelief and cold commands. Instead, he hesitated, his eyes drifting toward the kitchen where Aaron was humming an old soul song, a sound of joy that seemed to challenge every choice that had led him to his current life. "Handle it with a conversation," Do-hee said, his tone dismissive of the violence they expected. The room went silent. The men exchanged looks of confusion and burgeoning disrespect. To them, mercy was a weakness that gets you killed in their world. They saw a leader who was getting soft, a man who was trading his dark kingdom for a woman with a discount store uniform and a damaged face. Do-hee felt the shift in the room, the barely restrained violence now directed toward his own leadership. He knew that by valuing Aaron's moral authority over his own raw power, he was inviting a storm. Yet, as he watched Aaron trace the edge of a bandage on her cheek, he realized he didn't care. He would rather be vulnerable with her than live safe and alone in a world of shadows. The empire was cracking, but for the first time, Do-hee Jin felt he was finally standing on solid ground. The tension within the penthouse had reached a boiling point, the barely restrained violence of Do-hee's organization pressing against the glass walls of his sanctuary. Late that night, the city lights of Los Angeles sprawled beneath them like a kingdom of cold fire, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of bergamot and the weight of a choice that could no longer be deferred. Do-hee stood before Aaron, his sharp features carved from stone, his white shirt rumpled as he paced the room like a caged animal. "They think I'm drowning, Aaron," he whispered, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he hadn't felt in 15 years of controlling the underworld. "They see me choosing you, and they see a target. In my world, weakness gets you killed, but I don't care anymore." He crossed to her in 2 strides, cupping her face with devastating gentleness, his thumb ghosting over the edge of her fading bruise. "I'll leave it all. The organization, the penthouse, the power. I'll walk away from the shadows if it means I can wake up next to you without feeling like I'm trespassing in your life." It was the ultimate surrender, a king offering to abdicate his throne for a woman who had once been invisible to him. Aaron felt her heart hammer against her ribs, her fingers fisting in his shirt as she pulled him closer. She looked into his dark eyes, seeing the desperation and the hope he had placed entirely in her hands. "No," she whispered, her voice gaining a fierce moral authority that stopped his breath. "I won't ask you to give up who you are, Do-hee. I won't have you run from the world you built." He flinched, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Then what do you want? I can't survive losing you." "I want you to stay," Aaron said, her gaze steady and searching. "I want you to take all that power, all those resources that people fear, and use them to make others feel seen. Don't leave your kingdom. Transform it. Turn the shadows into a sanctuary for the people who are currently invisible, just like I was." Do-hee stared at her, the impossible reality of her request sinking in. She wasn't asking him to be a different man. She was asking him to be a better one. He bent slightly, bringing their faces level, his forehead resting against hers in a silent promise. The empire was indeed cracking, but as he kissed her, he realized he wasn't falling. He was finally coming home. The transition was not a quiet retreat, but a systematic rebuilding. Do Jin, the man who had once been a presence defined by quiet footsteps and the scent of danger, began to use his deadly calm to dismantle the very shadows he had spent 15 years perfecting. At the center of this new world was the Restoration Agency, a vision born from Erin's dream of maybe opening her own small cleaning business. It was no longer just about cleaning penthouses. It was a service that treated the invisible with the dignity they had been denied. The restaurants and businesses that once existed in the shadows were brought into the light. Do-hye utilized his vast capital not to order executions, but to ensure fair wages and benefits that other companies would eventually copy. Kale, who had learned the value of service over betrayal, was no longer a disheveled consequence of greed. He became one of the first supervisors, trained to see the workers, the single mothers, and the overlooked, not as labor, but as the only real thing in the city. Erin ran the operations with a steady moral authority. She ensured that the women who folded themselves smaller in elevators were given a voice and a stake in the company. She replaced the fear she once saw flickering in dark eyes with a sense of ownership. The penthouse, once a tomb of authoritative silence, became the headquarters of a mission that sought to heal the city of its learned invisibility. Do-hye watched her from the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand, looking at her as if she were rare and precious. He had traded his throne of blood for a partnership that felt like home. He no longer needed to make people disappear. He was too busy helping them be seen. The organization had become a sanctuary, and for the first time, the King of Shadows realized that the most powerful thing he could ever do was stand behind a woman who believed in joy, despite everything trying to crush it out of her. Years later, the penthouse was no longer a tomb of authoritative silence, but a home filled with the collision of worlds that had somehow formed something new. Erin stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, arranging a fresh bouquet of lilies. They weren't cheap bodega flowers anymore, but she still insisted on the ritual, a reminder of the days when she was a ghost moving through these rooms without disturbing the air. Do-hye watched her from the doorway, his white shirt hanging open to reveal the tattoo over his heart, her name in Korean characters, a permanent seal of the man she had helped him become. The dinner table was set for 3, a sight that would have been an impossible reality in the days of executions and blood. Kyle sat in the 3rd chair, no longer the disheveled consequence of his own greed, but a man who had earned his place through years of service and restoration. He was quiet, but the wide, fearful eyes of the traitor had been replaced by a calm, steady gaze. He looked at Erin and Do-hye not with terror, but with the gratitude of a man who had been given a second life. "Everything is ready," Erin said, her voice warm and carrying a pride that made Do-hye's heart race with the same terror and anticipation he'd felt the night of their first dinner. As they sat together, the city of Los Angeles sprawled beneath them, but the heights no longer felt lonely. They talked about the Restoration Agency's latest milestone, a new initiative for fair wages that other companies were finally starting to copy, and the small, everyday joys of a family built on the risk of being seen. Do-hye reached across the table, his hand covering Erin's, his thumb ghosting over her knuckles with that familiar, devastating gentleness. There was no more talk of shadows or debts. There was only the shaky breath of a man who realized he had finally survived his own dark empire. Erin looked at the 2 men, the boss who had surrendered his crown and the traitor who had found his soul, and she realized that her careful invisibility was a distant memory. In a city that had once made her feel like she was dying slowly, Erin Solvay had never felt more loved, more home, or more perfectly seen.